he claims Augustine would have effectively held to a sola scriptura position because he would have denied the infallibility of other rules outside of sacred scripture. Now, I know I've responded to that as well as
Right.
others, so there's certainly been responses to it, but I thought that was a misappropriation of St. Augustine. So perhaps that will make it to the book.
Oh, certainly. When it comes to the fathers on Sola Scriptura, well, I had a lot of prepared rebuttals because I wasn't exactly sure how Gavin would argue in the debate.
Mhm.
I didn't know, for example, if he would just do a blitzkrieg of the fathers and cite a
Mhm.
bunch of them mentioning the sufficiency of Scripture.
Sure.
So I went through and had about 20 prepared responses for each
Mhm.
of the fathers and ecclesial writers to say, okay, well, they do believe that some of them do believe in the material sufficiency of Scripture, that all salvific doctrines or even all doctrines are at least implicitly found in Scripture, but they recognize other infallible rules or they don't hold to formal sufficiency, and one by one going through them. But as the debate progressed, we just had a reference to Augustine, but no mention of a particular citation of an argument from him dealing with are there other infallible rules. And then Irenaeus, but nothing from Irenaeus, nothing for me to work with at all there. And I had lots of citations I would have happily gone into on Irenaeus and tradition and other matters like that. When it comes to Augustine, I know you've covered this before in your response to Gavin. The key here is, what does Augustine mean when he talks about plenary councils contradicting one another? And it seems clear he's engaging particular Cyprianic councils, particular regional councils
Mhm.
erred, and they can err in the very
Mhm.
regional.
Mhm.
But the ecumenical councils are a different question. So, and I didn't really engage Gavin a lot on this in the debate because he hardly brought it up. In fact, I wanted to preempt it by saying, if the earliest source you can get for Sola Scriptura in the Fathers is Augustine, well, that just seems like such a double standard to me, because Gavin will always say, like, how can we believe in the Assumption of Mary when the first father to talk about it is 400 years after the apostles? So, but he doesn't seem to flinch at all if the first father who mentions Sola Scriptura, you find him in the 5th century. So I do think that, to me, that's a big double standard to point out.
I think the difference he would probably argue is that, well, he doesn't see the fathers as some kind of infallible rule, whereas he thinks that we're saying somehow the fathers are an infallible rule
Right.
in this particular instance. And then, by the way, you have to have some kind of positive statement on their part asserting this, and you don't have it until much later. So, by your own standards, Catholics, you've somehow invalidated yourself.
Yeah, and what I would say here is that that's not really the argument either of us
Yeah.
is making. I
Yeah.
think the argument Gavin is making is an argument from silence, that if Mary had been assumed into heaven, we would expect the fathers to rights to attest to this in some form. So I can make a similar argument from silence, that if the apostles, and that was one of my arguments, an argument from patristic silence, a valid one, because I was very clear in the debate, and I just did another recent video on Sola Scriptura and the fathers, that I'm very clear. I am not saying every doctrine must be found in the earliest fathers or found in certain writings, but I'm saying that certain kinds of doctrines, like if there are the paradigmatic authority for the church and there was a change in early authority, that this is something we would expect them
Yeah.
to mention. And so if he's running a standard argument from silence on the Assumption of Mary, I believe it's completely fair game, because you can make a valid one dealing with Sola Scriptura. In fact, I have a future video or episode of the podcast I'm working on now about that particular argument from silence dealing with Mary, because I think you can find good evidence that among early Jews and Christians, there was widespread belief in other assumptions, in particular, the assumption of Moses' body into heaven,
Yeah.
and also Adam's body being taken up to paradise and being buried there. And so if the fathers, so far I've going through the fathers, I've only seen, I think, Clement of Alexandria mention the Assumption of Moses, and as the title of a book, not as the event itself. So I think I can find, look, there was widespread belief about this, but the fathers may not mention it. But that takes us far afield. So going back to Augustine, though, that was my preemptive. And then I thought that he might bring up the work of the Catholic scholar Robert Eno. In fact, I was hoping he would, to say, look, even Eno says that Augustine, didn't believe in that the ecumenical councils like Nicaea were infallible. To which that's just not what Eno says in his article on Augustine and doctrinal authority.
Right.
He says, as typical scholars do, it's a bit unclear
Yep.
but he does not see evidence from Augustine's writing. He believed that they were fallible, and he himself personally thinks that Augustine held to their infallibility.
Yeah, and there's plenty of stuff also in Eno that would work against his understanding of sola scriptura too. So, but I think you point out a very good rebuttal here, and that is Augustine very likely is not referring to ecumenical councils whenever he's referring to them erring. However, even if he does, we as Catholics believe that ecumenical councils, when they speak definitively, are infallible.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that when they're speaking non-definitively that they're infallible.
Right. Not every disciplinary canon of an ecumenical council is enforced today. Like if we went to war with other Christians, you can use crossbows, for example.
Mhm.
That was at one of the Lateran councils in their disciplinary canons. You could use crossbows against Muslims, you just couldn't use them against your fellow Christians. And
Mhm.
or prohibiting jousting. That you're right, that when we read the councils, just because disciplinary, and then this goes back all the way to the Council of Jerusalem, that
Mhm.
we have a dogmatic teaching about the inclusion of the Gentiles, for example, and then disciplinary canons about, let's say, abstaining from meat or blood or things like that, which were later revised in Paul's
Mhm.
letters to the Corinthians.
Yeah.
So,
And even non-definitive teachings could be reversed
right,
on the universal level. And so for me, it's like, even if what he's arguing here about Augustine is true, which is a major if, it still doesn't disprove our infallible rule whenever it speaks
right.
definitively. So for me, it's just completely a red herring. But hey, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this highlight clip. If you want to see the full interview, go to the description of this video and you'll see a link to the full thing. And by the way, hit the like button and the subscribe button. And if you want to support me at Reason and Theology, go to patreon.com/reason and theology. Thank you, and God bless.